Welcome back to this 7th session of the Acts of the Apostles Bible Study. I hope that you've been reading along after listening to these lessons. They will hopefully bring the words you are reading alive. Today we will cover chapters 20 through 23. Let's begin. First, chapter 20 is the story of a great journey. Paul is retracing his steps in cities where he has already founded churches. And his ultimate goal is to be in Jerusalem by Pentecost, and he's carrying along with him a donation he's collecting for the churches there. Now, this travelogue includes passages with the pronoun we. Like earlier in Acts, this may mean that Luke was with Paul and is reliving an amazing adventure that he shared with him. Now, travels like this are also well known in literature. Homer's Odyssey is the ancient epic, and Virgil's Aeneid, which had been written just 75 years or so before Paul's journey, maybe 100 years before Luke wrote this account, is another one of the amazing journeys around this particular area that's cataloged in literature. The Pentateuch in the Hebrew Scriptures is also a travel narrative, and we will discover in just a few chapters that just like the Pentateuch, which concludes with Moses looking out at the final destination, Acts will end with us wanting to know the conclusion. It could be that Luke was writing a story that people would have understood as relating to these great travel epics. Scholars believe that during the period described in the 20th chapter, Paul was writing two of his famous letters, 2 Corinthians and his masterpiece letter to the Romans, while he was in Corinth, waiting for the ship he didn't end up taking to Syria. There is a large traveling party cataloged here. Some scholars wonder if that was a security provision, as Paul was carrying donations to the church in Jerusalem. As he traveled, it would have also provided witnesses to the various communities that he had actually delivered the money. Now, there is a funny story of the young man named Eutychus, beginning in verse 9, presumably in Troas, which is a port on the Aegean Sea in present-day Turkey. Eutychus is up late listening to Paul's teaching when he falls asleep and falls out of the window to the ground. It's not funny that he fell out of the window. It is funny that Luke tells of how he fell asleep while listening to Paul speak. Paul went to him and proclaimed that he still lived. Now, we don't know if there was a healing or he just survived the fall. So Paul returns to the room, breaks bread, and then resumes the teaching until dawn. It is fitting, I guess, that the name Eutychus means lucky, and this gives you a snapshot of how Paul lived during this period of time. He was tireless in telling the story, and that meant teaching through the night even, to people who had probably worked throughout the day. Now, Paul is in a hurry after this, as he is trying to get to Jerusalem for Pentecost. So he chooses not to go to Ephesus. Instead, he invites the elders to a nearby place to talk to him. He points out in his talk that he is not the kind of teacher who does this work for profit. Instead, he is doing it for God, and his work with them, he was there for a long time setting up this church, was all done in love. Now, this is also a farewell speech for Paul to the people in Ephesus. He is tying up loose ends, and he warns them to stay alert and be aware of God's action in their lives. Chapter 20 concludes with Paul and these elders from Ephesus hugging and weeping together. Now, chapter 21 notes Paul's continued journey to Jerusalem. Paul stayed in Caesarea for a time, and there he met with Philip, one of the 7 deacons ordained in Acts 6, and who then baptized the Ethiopian eunuch. And he encounters the prophet Agabus, who was also mentioned earlier in Acts chapter 11. Agabus does not give Paul a good prophecy. He predicts that Paul will be bound and put in jail if he were to continue to Jerusalem. Now, Paul refused to stop, even though his friends and colleagues don't want him to risk traveling to Jerusalem. So Paul arrives in Jerusalem. We imagine that he probably got there in time for Pentecost, but it's not noted that he did. And he meets with his previous self, the religious authorities, the ones that are zealots for the law, just as Saul had been before his conversion. Paul goes about purifying himself, but he doesn't meet an understanding audience. Paul is known for teaching that Judaism is dead, and so is the law. Paul was beaten by these religious authorities and all of the crowds of people who they were inciting. And when the tribune arrived to restore order, Paul was ushered to prison, bound as Agabus had predicted. Now, on his way, he asked the tribune to let him speak. Now, this is a theme. Paul is portrayed as being able to move opinion if he's given the chance. The mobs don't want him to have the opportunity. It is kind of funny that the tribune, who was probably a young man from an aristocratic family beginning his professional life, asked Paul if he could speak Greek. Now, Paul was a master of Greek and was highly educated, not who the tribune had thought he was detaining. Now, he told the tribune that he was Jewish and from the city of Tarsus, and he left one bit of biographical information for later. He's also a Roman citizen. That request led to the speech by Paul recorded in chapter 22. Now, as Paul began, most likely not in classical Hebrew, but in Aramaic, which would be the tongue of everyday life in Jerusalem, Paul could speak many different languages. He could really speak fluently and cogently in all the languages, which is what made him an amazing evangelist. When he begins speaking in their language, he makes his audience comfortable and potentially amenable to his message. He pointed out important things that connected him with the audience. First, he was a student of Gamaliel. Remember that Gamaliel in chapter 5 had stood up for the rights of the apostles to teach about Jesus in the temple. He complimented their zealousness and told his story. Now, this is the second of 3 times that Luke has Paul tell his story. Words and space on the page was valuable, so Luke obviously wants his readers to know how Paul came to be an evangelist. Paul retold his role as a Pharisee and his authorization by the high priest to go to Damascus. This was an impressive credential to this group in Jerusalem. He then tells of the revelation on the way to Damascus and how he came to be a follower of the way. Now, Paul uses his speech to demonstrate his faithfulness to Judaism and why Jesus is the answer, the culmination of that faith, and that God is more than just for Jews. God is also for Gentiles. Okay, that is what Paul believes, but this is the point where he begins to lose the crowd that he's been talking to. They had heard about Paul selling their gods to others. That is the way they thought of it. Now he was trying to rationalize it with them. No, Paul was hopeful. He was always hopeful, which made him a great evangelist. He hoped that, unlike the older brother in the prodigal son parable, the Jews of Jerusalem would join the celebration with the returning young brother. But that was not the case. Paul's hope was dashed by the crowd's response to his mention of Gentiles. Beginning in the 23rd verse of chapter 22, Paul is forced to rely on his last card. The crowds want him taken away, so he finally claims Roman citizenship. You might ask, wouldn't everyone claim this if they were about to be beaten or killed by authorities? See, for those who lied, there was a severe penalty for falsely claiming citizenship. Might Paul have had the double-faced bronze tablet that authorized his citizenship, kind of like a birth certificate? We don't know. But in this last part of chapter 22, Paul makes this claim to raise his case to another level. This citizenship is a powerful weapon. The tribune, as noted in the Acts of the Apostles, was scared because he had bound Paul's hands. Obviously, the Roman status could lead to his demotion as a tribune. The ending of chapter 22 has Paul released and the tribune calling the chief priests and the council to come the next day to present their case. It seems that it was okay to beat non-Roman citizens. That was normal action for controlling the masses. That was how Jesus died. He was not a Roman citizen like Paul. The Christian movement was founded to challenge the acts of the powerful. Jesus' resurrection is a sign that human power had no sway. Now, chapter 23 begins the description of Paul's struggles with the religious and later political authorities. He first appeared before the Sanhedrin and the high priest Ananias. This is, of course, not the same Ananias who taught Paul about Jesus at Damascus. This Ananias is a known historical figure who served as the high priest in Jerusalem during the reigns of emperors Claudius and Nero. He was killed in 66 CE during a rebellion. Now, Paul's hearing didn't go well. You might imagine a group of religious legal experts facing probably the most well-versed religious legal expert in a court of law. They were used to pushing their laws down the throats of most of the people brought before the council. Paul turned his knowledge of the law into a mirror on how they were treating him. They hit him on the mouth, a sign that they felt he was lying, and he pointed out the law that condemned that. That, as you might imagine, made them even angrier. Paul walks a tightrope here. He respected the office, but he was willing to point out the injustice of it. That is his faithful responsibility, and that is the way to honor the law. Paul knew that this was not going to be a good hearing. He noted the biggest disagreement: resurrection. See, the Sanhedrin and the chief priests don't believe in it. Paul did, and the Pharisees believed in some form of afterlife, a spirit or angel life, but they weren't totally convinced. None of them, except for Paul, believed that Jesus was resurrected. Now, some of the Pharisees who heard Paul, like Gamaliel earlier in Acts, wondered if Paul might be telling the truth about seeing a vision and receiving a message from God. I mean, they wanted to know more. The hearing with the Sanhedrin went downhill, and thankfully for Paul, the tribune stepped in, taking him into custody again and promising to return the following day. Paul had a vision that night that he would make it safely to Rome, and in a different part of the city at the same time, his sister's son heard of plans to kill Paul the following day. Now, this brief mention is the only one about Paul's family. We don't know if they were Christian or if there were many of them in Jerusalem, but this boy came to the jail to tell Paul, and Paul told him to tell the tribune. Now, the tribune is responsible for Paul because Paul is a Roman citizen. And so the tribune gets 2 centurions and their squads, reported as a force of 470 people, and sent them as guards over Paul to the governor Felix in Caesarea. Felix would have been a successor of Pontius Pilate by about 25-30 years. The tribune sends a message with Paul announcing the problem. The letter points out that the religious leaders are complaining about their law. But the tribune also says that he doesn't see any offense worthy of death or even imprisonment. The governor, Felix, interviews Paul, and he hopes that he can pass the responsibility to someone else. But Paul reports where he's from, Tarsus, which is in the province of Cilicia. It is also under the authority of the governor of Syria, just like Judea was. So Felix has no choice. Now, we know a little bit about Felix historically. He was born a slave, but had found favor with Emperor Claudius, so he went up the ranks to really the top, to being a governor. Now, the aristocrats there looked down at him, so he had to watch his flank on multiple sides. He served as the governor in Syria from 52 to 59 CE. See, that helps us date this event in the Acts of the Apostles, probably to the late 50s. Now, that concludes our studies of chapters 20 through 23. Now, the focus of these chapters was on Paul's return to Jerusalem and the subsequent accusations and the resulting imprisonment. We will conclude the book next week with chapters 24 through 28. We will find out what happened to Paul in Felix's court and how he made it to Rome for the first time. Please let me know if you have any questions about the Acts of the Apostles.